You just hit the little blue button that lets you know that it is recording. They moved it if you've got an updated version. So today we're going to talk about trauma assumed ABA. All right, my floating meeting controls. And this is, a couple points of clarification. This is not like a subset of applied behavior analysis. This is not some sort of like official variant of applied behavior analysis. This is just the work of several kind of people in our field who have taken kind of what we know about trauma-informed care and kind of melded it with what we know. I did this training originally in 2022 when the kind of article that all this is based on came out by Dr. Dittu Rajaraman and a couple other awesome people. And it's at the end, there's a bunch of sources that you can take a look at. So, and just reminders, I don't have a slide for it, but if you do chime in to ask any questions or make any comments, just make sure you're not using any client information whatsoever, names, initials, etc. So we're going to talk about trauma assumed ABA. All right, so we got to start with the definition of trauma so that we can kind of all be on the same page. Different people have different kind of subsets of experience based on their background and things like that. So we got two different definitions. The first one's from SAMHSA. So an individual trauma results from an event or series of events, and it leads to lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being, right? So something traumatic occurs and it creates an adverse lasting effect. So it's not just like, that was upsetting, and then you never think about it again, right? It really falls on that requirement of lasting adverse effects. And then the APA just calls it an emotional response to a terrible event, such as accident, rape, or natural disaster. So that one is very different. They're two very different definitions, but just float them out there to kind of think about. So what does trauma do? What are the results of a traumatic event? So they do, as behaviorists, we like to look at things in terms of behavior. And we can kind of look at the behaviors, the responses that occur in response to a traumatic event. So we say anxiety, right? So if you look at PTSD or other trauma kind of things, they fall under the anxiety umbrella. Avoidance, staying away from things, avoiding things, going out of their way to not encounter things, and sometimes even aggression, usually for the purpose of avoidance. And so what all these kind of boil down to in our behavioral definition is they're receiving less reinforcement from their environment. They're missing out on things that they could derive joy from. So it is related to PTSD, but it's not the exact same thing, right? So PTSD is specific diagnosis. You can have a trauma kind of effect on your behavior, on your psyche, without actually having a full diagnosis of PTSD. And it's not just, kind of the classic definition where like, oh no, you didn't see anybody die, you weren't in war, you can't have trauma. It's far expanded to include many, many things, including vicarious trauma, which could impact you guys. So, when we're working with people who've experienced trauma, you can experience trauma from just kind of talking to them, which is just absolutely kind of mind-boggling. But if you've worked in the field long enough, you know it to be true. So some statistics to kind of mull around on. The National Center for PTSD, yep, is looking at more than half or more of all adults will experience at least one traumatic event, which is, pretty wild. And that's, most of these statistics are typically considered underreported. CDC, 61% of adults experience an ACE, an adverse child experience, and 16% 4 or more. So you think of, the general kind of population, you think of maybe yourself or people that it's likely that you experience one thing, but you think of people in other areas of the world where it's not as safe And 16% is pretty significant. They're experiencing 4 or more. So people in places of poverty, war, famine, etc., they're experiencing a lot more of these things. And then there are particular populations, namely those with developmental and intellectual disabilities, who are much more likely to experience potentially traumatic events. I didn't put a specific statistic here because you see them, they vary a lot. But the kind of, which makes you worried, like, oh, is it real? Yeah, it's absolutely real, because the one thing they can agree on is that it's significantly higher. Whether it's twice as much or a quarter as much or 3 times as much, we know that it impacts our population in particular more than others, including physical, emotional, sexual abuse. So it's something to really something that we need to be aware of as practitioners with the autism population, because children with developmental delays, they are more likely to be abused or neglected. Okay, so they're more likely to be targeted. So the people out there who are abusing or neglecting are often focusing on populations like this, because of kind of the other things we'll talk about, such as they're less likely to advocate for themselves. Okay, so because of things like their communication ability, which is the next one, okay, they don't have as much opportunity or ability to be able to tell someone what happened. So their self-reporting, their self-advocacy is lower. So again, that kind of goes back to the first one, like people are preying on them because they know, like, oh, they're not going to tell anybody, or nobody's going to believe them, or they're going to think that they're making it up. So it's really disturbing if you look at the statistics about the autism population, the IDD population, and their experiences with abuse. Less likely to have a strong support group outside of their family. Okay, so when you think, like, as a teenager, as an adolescent, who you would have gone to if something terrible happened, you probably would have gone to your parents, but you might have gone to your friends first or after or during. So if you don't have a strong friend group, which I'm going to say the majority of our population that we're working with does not. They might have friends, but do they have friends they can talk about serious things about, or the language to talk about those things? It's less likely. So that puts them in a rougher kind of experience. And they're more susceptible to being taught in a compliance-focused manner. Just talking about this with colleagues or friends the other day. I can't remember who it was, but when you were a young person and your parents said, you can't watch this, or you can't go here, or you can't do this, we in many cases found a way. We manipulated or lied, or we did something so that, or we talked our way out of it. We put together a solid kind of, oh, this is why. So we're kind of better at kind of weaseling around those things. So people on the autism spectrum with developmental diagnoses, they are more susceptible to being taught in a 100% compliance manner. So we're going to talk about this a lot, but I'll state it for the first time here, is that if you're teaching kids to always do everything that an adult says, under all circumstances, you are setting them up to be the victim of abuse in the future. So it's really something that I think about a lot. We really need to, kind of be teaching them to say no at times, giving them their voice, and kind of, helping them kind of build that skill. So the idea of trauma assumed care, right? So the article was trauma informed ABA, but we're really kind of pushing this idea of trauma assumed care is because we have not been trained. Maybe some people watching this have been, but I have not been trained to do any trauma assessments. I don't know how to determine if a person has or does not have trauma, or what level of trauma they have. And we don't need to learn that skill. That is a skill that some people have. We don't need that skill because we are not trauma therapists. We just want to build trauma assumed care into what we already do. So we don't need to have that skill, because all we need to do is just treat every person we encounter professionally as if they have experienced trauma, because the likelihood is high, right? As we saw those statistics, the likelihood is high. So it's very much like using universal or standard precautions, right? So anytime I encounter someone, it's like always be kind, right? Same idea. Always treat someone as if they could have potentially had, a traumatic event in their life. And this is really a circumstances approach, right? So we're looking at what happened to people rather than thinking about what's wrong with them. Oh my God, what's wrong with this person? Why are they driving that way? What an idiot. We're thinking like, oh boy, something really, really must have made this person upset. Something must be going on that would cause this person to kind of engage in that behavior. And that's how we think, or how we should be thinking about the kids that we work with. Is what caused them to get there. I'm just realizing I never moved these slides around. My little box is gonna block on the recording. That's okay. They'll be able to figure it out. So consent and assent. Okay, so the actual definitions of these two. Consent is a legal permission given to have treatment. So a person can only give consent if they're 18 years or older. So that's like the official legal kind of, permission to treat. Assent, okay, is not a legal requirement, but more something that's ethically kind of responsible that we have towards the individuals that we care for. So it could be a person of any age, just kind of agreeing to what's going on, which involves a lot of things like understanding of what the treatment looks like and all sorts of things like that, which can be really difficult with a population with limited language, but it's something that we're going for. And we're going to talk about kind of how that works. So the first piece of that is that everyone, regardless of language, including animals and, any living kind of creature, has the ability to communicate no, right? So, it's really one of our kind of core kind of needs as therapists is to be able to identify when a person is saying no through their behavior. So obviously, if they say, no, I don't like that, please don't do that, that's a very clear, kind of spoken no. But if they shove you and scream, that seems probably like a pretty clear no as well. So we really need to start learning and understanding the ways that all of the individuals that we work with say no. And we need to be able to honor those no's for the clients in our care. We need to teach them that when they say no, that has meaning to it. And we'll talk more about that. It's not as simple as just that, but we just want to kind of lay that groundwork. So, kind of a question here, just to, you don't need to throw out answers, but, think, can we legitimately and effectively do our job while honoring all protest behavior, right? So anything that tells us they're not happy with what's going on, we automatically stop, remove any kind of demands. Can we really do our job if we're doing that? No. I say probably not. No, we can't, right? Every time a kid is a little bit annoyed with what's going on, we just immediately stop. No, and it wouldn't be valuable to teach in that way. Like, we want our kids to be successful in the world in which they live. And the world in which we live is not full of just, lollipops and sunshine, right? There's a lot of stuff that's really kind of rough to deal with, and oftentimes on the other side of those difficult things are the best things in life. So, no, we probably can't, but what we can and must do is we really need to consider the protest behavior and really think about what that tells us, right? So if a kid, especially if they're engaging in severe problem behavior or consistent problem behavior, they're really fighting to get out of things. Why? We talk about this all the time, but is it too hard? Is the reinforcement not great enough? What is going on? So in the moment, we might need to maintain that expectation so that they're not kind of learning just to get around it, but we need to consider that. So in this Rajaraman article, he gives a real clear set of steps to providing informed, trauma-informed assumed care. All right, so we got 4 steps, and we're going to break each of them down. put that down there for now. You guys don't even know what that means. I'm moving my little thing there so I can see. So we've got 4 key commitments that we're going to talk about one at a time. So we need to acknowledge trauma and its potential impact, right? So that's slightly the easiest, maybe most obvious. Ensure safety and trust, promote choice and shared governance, one of my favorite words, and emphasize skill building. So we're going to go through each of those kind of one at a time. So number 1, we're going to acknowledge potential trauma. Okay, so it may be best to just assume that anyone accepting our services, including their parents, including their teachers, their caregivers, anyone we interact with, okay, but especially the clients who we're providing treatment to, have a history of trauma, right? So we're not going to say, I wonder if this person has trauma. Should we use a trauma-informed approach? Probably. We're just going to use a trauma-assumed approach. We're going to say, they did. If they didn't, we're going to treat them with these standards anyway. And we're going to be vigilant. So they use our favorite word, or my favorite word, vigilance with respect to observing avoidance or negative emotional behavior. Okay, so we're really looking for those signals of no, right? So when a person is saying, this isn't okay with me, I'm not comfortable, I'm not happy, this isn't all right. So we have to be vigilant for those things, because sometimes they're real loud and in your face, and sometimes they're just a whisper in the wind, right? So it would be unfair for you to only pay attention to the big, loud, in your face ones when some of our kids are only capable or only at a point where they can kind of do the whispery ones. So we gotta be vigilant. So we'll break that down. So we're going to assume a history of trauma. Number 1, we're just going to say, oh, yep. Whether they did or they didn't, we're just going to assume that they have. And because of that, we're going to exercise caution. We're going to be careful, which we should be no matter what, whether we assume trauma or not, we should be careful. When we're deciding what to teach, when we're deciding how to teach, we should be really careful about those things. And then we're going to be vigilant of avoidance and negative emotional behavior. We're going to watch for those indicators of unhappiness, those kind of no's, whether they're verbal or physical or whatever they might be. It might just be a change in the way their face looks. We need to be that vigilant that we can pick up like, oh, hold on, they're uncomfortable. Let's rethink this, right? And, hold those thoughts in your head. You're like, well, I'm not going to stop everything I'm doing just because they're uncomfortable. That's right. That would be, okay. So we're thinking about, as we acknowledge trauma, we're thinking about the stuff that they might not be able to verbalize. And, if I were in a situation where I were being made to do something I didn't really want to do, I'd be having thoughts too. I might not say them, but I'd be thinking them. So, think about the kids in our care. They're thinking, are they going to hurt me? You might know, like, well, I would never hurt this kid, but they don't know that, right? How would they know that? They're thinking, can I trust this person? Are they going to do what they say they're going to do? Are they going to be, am I safe? Are they going to make me do things I don't want to do? Most likely you are, right? So you're coming in, you're going to ask them to do things they might not want to do. Are they going to take my stuff, right? So a lot of times we come into the house and their iPad gets put away and their food gets put on a shelf, and then they have to kind of ask for these things, which, is the bottom one. Are they going to take my favorite things and make me earn them instead of just having them? Right? Like, that's like, if you walked into this training room and I just started taking phones and saying like, okay, if you answer a question really nicely, I'll give you your phone back. That's your phone, right? The previous history of that phone is that you've got it because it's yours. So if I take that from you and now you have to earn it, it feels really yucky. Whether we think like, well, it's not really theirs anyway, that's their parents paid for it. I don't think about their kind of mentality. Or they can maybe stop stimming, because you better believe someone at some point has told them to stop, or held their hands down, or programmed to make it go away. So you're thinking about, the stuff that you can't see, and that you can't see, those thoughts can turn into these actions that we're talking about. Oh, bouncing happy face tells us that you need your first keyword. So your keywords today have a theme. So they are going to be animals that you can find on my farm. Not my farm, but on my family's farm. So there's gonna be 3 of them. So the first one is cow, right? There's actually 6 cows, but I think the answer is just cow. So 3 animals that you might find, that you will find on the Harvey farm. The first one is cow. Okay. Thank you, happy bouncing, happy face. All right, so part of this first part of us, kind of this assumption and recognition of trauma is that we're going to actively seek to avoid re-traumatization. Okay, which requires vigilance. We have to be aware. We have to be looking. We have to be careful. So how do we avoid re-traumatization? We're not going to include programming that is going to potentially re-traumatize them. That's going to expose them directly to things that we know will make them upset. Okay, unless it's indicated by the treatment, right? So if they're terrified of water, any water, right? I mean, you could argue like if they're terrified of swimming, like, okay, well, a person doesn't really have to swim, maybe that's not that big a deal. But if they're terrified by water, any kind of water, well, that's probably something we need to work on because people need water. If they're terrified of any insect whatsoever, which I think that I've heard in the last week through supervision, I think I've heard of 3 separate independent individuals in our care who are just terrified, run screaming from any kind of bug. That's something that we need to work on, right? So that is potentially traumatizing, but we need to address that with treatment, right? But we have to do it in a very careful, informed way. We're not just going to flood and shove a bug in their face and say, you got to deal with it, right? Or just lock them in a room full of bugs, right? We're obviously not going to do any of those things, but we're going to use maybe graduated exposure. We're going to use those sorts of methods to safely kind of bring them to where they need to be so that they can enjoy life. But we're never just going to do this just like on a whim. We're never just going to make that choice without the guidance of others. And we're always looking for those signs of negative emotional responding. That's how they kind of phrased it, in this article. So those no's, right? So when they're telling you no, really those negative emotional responding, they're crying, they're leaning away, they're leaning back in their chair, they're running away, they're pushing, they're, whatever it is that they're doing. And again, you really have to be vigilant for this. You can't just expect it to be obvious because it's not always going to be obvious. All right, step 2, creating safe and reinforcing environments to avoid traumatization. Okay, so we're going to build an environment where they feel safe. And that's, if you look, in the near future, we'll be having a lot of trainings on Dr. Hanley's practical functional assessment kind of world, kind of approach. And that's really step 1, is making the kids, you guys heard us say happy, relaxed, and engaged. That's a Dr. Hanley thing, right? So before you start putting those difficult kind of expectations on the kid, you want them to be in a state of safe, strong reinforcement, okay? So you want to create this environment, as they refer to as environment that's free of impending harm while behaving in a context with minimal aversive stimulation. There we go. Stimulation, as indicated by no or minimal engagement and avoidance or escape of that context. So boils down to, you want a place where they're not constantly trying to run away. We've all had that situation where you're trying to work with the kid and they're just trying everything they possibly can to escape. Get me out of here, get me away from this person. I don't want to do this. That makes your life really difficult. You learn very little. There's very little actual teaching going on in these situations. So we really want to find that place where they are happy, relaxed, and engaged, at least the vast majority of the time. And that's going to help us avoid these feelings of traumatization. So we can build trust through respect. What's that mean? Okay, so this is really respecting the child, respecting when they say no. In many cases, when possible, we're going to remove that demand. Okay, and being consistent, showing up per session, the first piece of that, but really doing the things that are expected. So if they have earned their reinforcement, they get it. If they're supposed to get something, we have it available, unless we program that they need to wait for it. Remembering that pairing never ends. Okay, so, oh, I've been working with this kid for like 2 months, so I don't have to worry about pairing. Wrong, right? Any kind of relationship is a relationship, so it doesn't continue unless you're working on it. So you're always thinking of new things to keep them engaged, to make them happy, to build your trust in relationship. Always keeping the happy bucket much fuller than the danger bucket. Okay, so if you're thinking of a environment of safety, you want the kid to see you as a bringer of good things. And that doesn't have to necessarily be tangible things. If you took the previous mini training on play routines and social chains, that might be a really fun, game that you're playing with them, or, something, you play with something they already have. But all those things that make them laugh and smile, we call them indices or indications of happiness, right? So whatever it is they do that shows you that they're having a good time, that stuff is happening way more than stuff that indicates, okay, good stuff is going away. Now we're going to do the hard, difficult stuff. So you kind of like go to in ABA is 80-20, right? So 80% should be in that happy bucket. We should avoid re-traumatization. We shouldn't make that as much of a priority as physical safety. Okay. So if we're putting them in situations where they're just utterly falling apart, screaming, melting down, crying, running, putting themselves in danger because they're so upset. That's as much of a mistake on our part as if, we're allowing them to run out into a busy street. So we really have to put this kind of priority on trauma and avoiding re-traumatization. And really minimizing punishment and coercion. You can't make it go away, right? You can try to tell me you don't use punishment in your treatment, and you're wrong. It is just baked into our culture, our society, our teaching, our interactions. It's just there. Because remember, as behaviorists, punishment just means we're making something happen less often in the future. Okay. We have a handful of kids who do not really have any kind of problem behavior. So maybe in those cases, but for the most part, we are. And there's absolutely no way you're not using coercion in some way. Just you kind of being in their house or their space is kind of coercive, or trying to get them to do things they wouldn't just naturally be doing. Using reinforcement is coercive. It feels great. Like we're like, no, I'm giving you something awesome that you really want. But if I'm giving you that thing to touch your nose, would you have touched your nose if I didn't give you that thing? No, you'd still be sitting on the couch or whatever. So there is some coercion baked into any kind of reinforcement, but we want to minimize it, right? We want to decrease that as much as possible. Number 3, promoting client choice and autonomy, right? So our kids that we work with, people with developmental disorders, their amount of autonomy in the world is low. Any child's autonomy is low. They can't, like we think like, oh, they really rule the roost, but I've got a car. I could walk out of this room. I could drive somewhere. I have money. I could buy food. I could buy a ticket to a movie. We have a lot of choices in the world. Even still then, like, we're still controlled by a lot of coercion and things like that. But kids have almost no agency or autonomy. Right? Maybe like people kind of jump and do what they want. They're walking on eggshells around them, but they still just don't have that ability to just kind of do whatever they want. So how do we do this? We build an environment where they don't feel powerless, where they have choices, right? So we need to arrange for choice making, okay? And offering things that are all desirable. So it's not like, hey, do you want candy, or do you want asparagus, right? There's a few people, maybe someone watching this is like, I choose the asparagus. That's awesome. You're much healthier than most people. But most kids would choose the candy. That's not really a choice, right? You're really telling them like, oh, well, they're going to pick the candy. That's why I don't even have asparagus. I said candy or asparagus, assuming that you would not choose asparagus. So that's not a choice, right? Do you want to play this game, or do you want to sit in timeout? We do that. That's not a choice either. So we really want to build up their, like, okay, what, should we do this this or, like using whatever skill they have in choice making, we really want to build those into what we do. So that does, mean going back to our staff meeting this week where we talked about being over prepared. You need to be prepared for multiple things. If you're going to give them a choice, then you need to have the ability to do multiple things. So you're preparing more than one thing per activity kind of block. You need to understand and honor the no's of your client, right? So if it's something where the choice is yes or no and they pick no, guess what? That's not a choice if you're not going to honor that no. You didn't actually give them a choice. You kind of maybe felt good, like, oh, I'm giving them a choice, because I think they're going to pick yes, but then they say no. That's not a choice. A choice means that both options are viable, unless safety is involved. Okay, and this is one of the things that I think is just the coolest thing. If you watch any of Dr. Hanley, any of the stuff they do, and if you watch them, you'll be like, nah, that wouldn't apply to the kids I work with. They have replicated this with kid after kid after kid, adult after adult, in setting after setting. And there's always they call it like their open door policy. The kid can always choose, they can always just leave. And they can leave and go and do their favorite stuff. So, but they don't, right? So with really strong teaching, with strong pairing, with trust and safety, and this sort of approach, they will choose, even if it's harder to stay, they will choose as long as you're being consistent and honoring their no's and providing strong reinforcers. So we really want to move towards that. This is really hard, but unless safety is involved, in which case, like if they have the ability to run out into the street, no, you're not just going to let them just run out of, they can't just get out of the car while you're driving, right? There's lots of examples where safety would be involved. And really looking at shared governance, right? So I really want you to think of sessions as our session. It's not my session. It's not even just the client session, right? And you think of this in like terms of like parenting, right? So it's a relationship where everybody has some power and some control. It's not just one person or the other kind of calling all shots. We want everybody to feel kind of empowered and happy and safe and trusting and all those sorts of things. So we want everybody to have choices. Nobody's, being put, in a place where they feel unsafe or unheard. And everybody's experiencing reinforcement. Right. So I think the next slide is looking at some examples of that. Oh, right. So we always have to think who has the power. That's for old school people. Jeff is on here, I know. So hopefully he's giggling. I can't see him, but He-Man.
I think you're implying something, Rob.
I am, Jeff. You're younger than me, but still pretty darn close. So just thinking of ways that people say no, right? So we kind of went over this, but just remembering that all behavior tells a story. All behavior has a function. No behavior happens just random. I know it feels that way, but it just means you can't see it. So what are they doing? What are their indicators that they say no? Some kids run, some kids swipe, some kids yell, some kids cry, some kids shut down, which is not really, Ashley's on here too, and she's thinking, don't you dare put shut down as a behavior because a dead man could shut down, right? I mean, like, well, they just shut down, right? Well, that really means they're kind of doing nothing, but we all kind of know when like a person is isolating or moving away or, looking off or whatever it might be, but that might not be something overt. It might certainly not be something that's dangerous. It might be something that even people see as a preferred behavior. Oh yeah, they just kind of shut down, in circle time. They just kind of sit there doing nothing. It's great, right? Like for a lot of these teachers, that's really preferable behavior because they're not causing a problem, but that is not pro-social. It's not adaptive. They might hit, bite, pinch, kick, punch, throw, whatever. They might hide. Okay? Every person says no a little bit differently. You might look similar, but and I just want you to consider that maybe we do a lot of accepting no programs with the kids that we work with. Maybe it's us that need to have an accepting no program you know, because we get super bent out of shape when a kid tells us no, right? And sometimes we have to maintain the expectation. Not saying never, but there are definitely times where we need to kind of be able to accept those no's. So crisis behavior is really the ultimate no. I'm not doing this, I'm unhappy. And it's really kind of beyond those initial stages. So this picture, so I created this kind of flow chart at the bottom of a chain of behaviors that's escalating. And I half intentionally and half just because it's hard to find pictures that you want for the same person. This is clearly not this, it's supposed to follow one individual, but the person is obviously changing through every different example. But it doesn't change the fact that it is a chain of behavior starting at something that's really kind of like low danger, right? So the kid's got an angry face and they're crossing their arms, okay? So that kid right there is telling me no. That's where I want to intervene. Be like, hey, buddy, it looks like you're upset. You know, maybe we don't need to finish this right now. Maybe we can do this later. Or, you know, let's finish one more and then let's take a walk, or let's take a break now. But I'm seeing that initial kind of behavior, okay? Because here we see an escalation chain. So now they're stomping, right? They're standing up. They're given some posturing at the least, and now they're throwing stuff. All of a sudden they have pigtails. Okay, don't know how that happened, but now they're throwing stuff, and now they're punching an adult, right? So we've got this kind of chain of events, and it's our job to be vigilant and catch those early signs of no, so that we never ever get to that last step, right? Are you going to be able to avoid every single one? No, but if you know that it's coming, if you know when they fold their hands and they make that angry face that it's likely that they'll start punching heads, right? It is your responsibility as the trained adult to respond to that and to try to avoid it from happening. So, you know, at some point it goes beyond those initial kind of communications of, I don't want to do this, I'm not okay with this, which is like the first picture, you know, maybe even the second picture into the third picture. You know, and then they move into what Dr. Hanley calls the emotional borderlands, which is where it's not even about what it was initially about anymore, right? Have you ever been so upset that you can't remember why you got upset? You were in the emotional borderlands, right? The function got kind of canceled out, and the function now is just, you're just upset, and it just kind of perpetuates, okay? So we want to stay away from that. So you need to recognize that those first behaviors, even the throwing books is communicate. Well, the punching is communication too, but you want to catch those things and honor those no's earlier and really praise and shape that. You know, I love the way that you're telling me you don't want to do this. You know, might be like, thank you for stomping your feet, because that tells me you're upset. You know, that's really awesome. Let's take a break. Let's get out of here for a little bit. Like, oh, I can't reinforce foot stomping. Okay. I'd much rather reinforce foot stomping and not get to face punching 100 times out of 100. So we're really looking for this idea of cooperation or collaboration over compliance. For years and years and years, we've been teaching compliance. And that's something we need to move beyond. We need to think about being collaborators with the individuals that we're working with. You know, for how many years have we been told we need to incorporate them and their feedback into our treatment plans? We need to honor what they want, you know, so that's what social significance is all about. Sometimes, yeah, we're the expert and we know kind of what's better for them, which kind of feels like yucky to say, and it should a little bit. So that's good if you've got those like, oh, I don't know if I like that. I don't really like it either, but there are some cases where, you know, we recognize they can't just, you know, live on soda and cheese puffs, you know, for the rest of their lives. There are some things that people have to do, but we're not moving towards straight 100% compliance, right? That's dangerous, and it should be reserved only for things like adherence to laws, rules, and safety procedures. You can't say no to leaving the building when there's a fire, right? So we have to comply with a fire alarm. So there's ways to kind of build towards that, right? But they need to adhere to that. right? They need to follow laws or they're going to end up in jail. There's a ridiculous overrepresentation of autistic individuals in jail, right? Because social cues are difficult, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so they do need to adhere to those things. Okay, but for other things, we really want to move towards this balance, that shared governance again, where everyone feels safe, everyone's getting reinforcement, progress is being made, but not at the expense of the child having no choice, no say, no ability to say no. Okay. Teaching straight compliance, as I mentioned before, is dangerous and unethical, right? Those are if you teach a kid to always say yes to an adult, they're going to end up in a terrible sexual abuse situation. Well, not guaranteed, but it's very likely. So you gotta stay away from it. And really think about, is interrupting or teaching to stop STEM behavior, is that ethical? In many cases, it's not. It's not like you cannot teach, teach a kid to stop stimming, right? You can't replace the stimming behavior. I'm not going to say that because that's not true. If the kid's stim is throwing sharpened pencils, right? That's super dangerous. And that impinges on the rights of the people around them and the safety of people around them. Okay. But if their stim is kind of like a hand flap or kind of like looking at their hand or whatever it might be, in most cases, I'm going to say teaching them to stop doing that is pretty unethical. Over time, you might build their awareness and they might kind of stop doing it anyway, but it's filling a need, right? And just a disclaimer, and here's what Dr. Hanley calls it. He calls them CABs, or contextually appropriate behaviors. And he was a co-writer of the Rajaraman article, so I keep referencing him, but he was kind of part of the impetus of this. But just remember, like, regardless of what you call it, whether you call it compliance or adherence or cooperation or collaboration, it doesn't matter what you call it if what you're doing is still compliance training, right? So that's the behavior is the most important part. So here's a few examples of shared governance, okay? And I got Ashley here. I don't know if anybody else joined. There's only a handful of you, but tell me what maybe is the best representation of shared governance in this collection of pictures. Throw it in the chat or call it out. Shared.
E?
What was that?
I was wondering about E.
Okay, I like E. E is pretty darn good.
Because
right?
the officer is getting down to their level. He's engaging them directly.
Yep. He's below, right? He's actually below their level, which is almost like, giving up some control. Okay. Do we have another one that we like?
I liked D. I couldn't really tell what was happening in E.
Yeah, it's weird, right? E is a little bit like, what is going on? Why is he laying? Is that a pool there next to? I can't really tell. Yeah, I like D too. Right. So those are the ones in there, but even those I want you to think about are not perfect. There is no perfect example of shared governance where you have a perfect 50-50 split where everybody is on an exact equal playing field, right? So your shared governance is going to kind of look like a seesaw a little bit, or a teeter-totter, whichever you prefer calling it, which I've heard are outlawed in a lot of schools. But you want it to teeter-totter slightly, not like this, okay? And I'll say, well, why, Rob? Why are D and E not perfect examples of shared governance? Well, I'll start with D, right? So, Dad looks pretty into the game. I think he's probably better at it than these other two, right? So if they're playing Mario Kart, he's going to win every round unless he lets them win. See where I'm going with that? So there is a little bit of like, he's still got most of the choices here. It's not completely shared. And then E, I can definitely say, even though I love that he's down on the ground, he's showing like he's giving up kind of that leadership. He's still got a gun on his hip. He's still a police officer. So he still has, the authority in this situation when it comes down to it. So it's not to say like there's anything wrong with either of those pictures. That's kind of what we do. Like, we are still going to be the adult. We're still going to be the teacher. So shared governance is really hard. So that's why we have to kind of work so hard towards it. The other examples are all supposed to, A is pretty good too. But again, that guy's got a gun like right on the front of him, and that kid's like dirty and, So there's a lot of stuff about that one, but particularly the other ones are all, to me, obvious examples of governance that is not shared. All right, happy bouncing, happy face. All right, so second animal that lives on the Harvey farm, cat. It's not terribly, we don't have a terribly exotic farm, by the way, if you hadn't figured it out. So code word number 2 is cat. There's actually 5 of them. 3 of them live in the house. 2 of them are not even barn cats. They are like wild cats, but they're very kind. They don't like to be pet, but they're nice cats. Cat. All right. Next thing we need to do is assume understanding. We're still on shared governance, but we're always going to assume understanding or assume competence. Okay, so whether we don't know what they know and what they don't know, we have behavioral kind of indications of what we think they know, but we never are going to know completely. So we're going to assume that their receptive skills are greater than their expressive. So we're going to assume that they understand more of what they hear than what they're communicating outwards, which just means that I'm not going to talk about them like they're not present. I'm not going to talk about them in front of them, you know, like they can't hear me. Okay, I'm going to say, you know, I'm going to talk to them about their treatment to some extent. You know, I'm going to say, all right, buddy, I need you to sign your treatment plan. You know, so this just says, you know, this is how we help you. It goes through, you know, whether they have 0 language or, you know, a lot of language, and they're, you know, we have them sign. I'm going to kind of explain it to them. You know, I'm going to talk to them as if they're humans, because they are. And this should extend through your treatment, you know, so this is where I'm not going to treat them like they are, you know, I'm not going to kind of treat them like infants just because maybe their developmental age is lower. Sky, go ahead. You had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering how you sort of navigate this when caregivers are present or involved, specifically parents, not necessarily like daycare staff, but if you're like in the home, and a parent's trying to talk to you about the client who's sitting right there, and they're talking to you about the client, like the client's not sitting there, how do you sort of shift that conversation?
Yeah, it's real difficult. What I would encourage you to do is, and we're going to talk a little bit about barriers coming up in one of the other slides, and this is definitely one of them, but what I would encourage you to do is to in front of the kids say, hey, I'm not really comfortable when we talk about, you know, Samantha right in front of her. You know, can we have this conversation in another room? And, you know, I know the reality is, in a lot of times they're going to be like, ah, it doesn't matter. You know, they don't understand. I do this all the time. You know, and then again, like I would say like, well, okay, I get it, but it really would make me more comfortable if we did it at another time. You know, because then if we are presuming competence, they're hearing you kind of sticking up for them in whatever way that it kind of filters in. So it's not a perfect answer. I think that's what I would like you to do. I think that what I would usually do is I would kind of rush the conversation a little bit or not pay much attention to it. I would kind of not be dismissive, but I wouldn't like talk much, and I would focus on the kid, which is always my go-to. Just having fun with the kid. And then later I'd be like, hey, you know, before when we were talking about Samantha, you know, it felt a little weird for me to talk about her in front of her. Can we have those conversations here like we're doing right now, where she's kind of out of range? Because we wouldn't talk about your other kids while they were in the room the way that we're doing now. And, you know, as a practitioner of ABA, I assume understanding. So, you know, there is a very good chance that she does know we're talking about her. So not a perfect answer, but that's what I would recommend. Hopefully that's at least slightly helpful. But we can
thank you.
Perfect. And we could take that, you know, in supervision or in any other range in the future. So number 4, final step is teaching adaptive skills whenever possible. This is the easiest one for us as ABA people to latch onto. We're all about training skills. That's what we do. So this is our bread and butter, right? So stopping behaviors is always secondary to teaching them new skills, okay? So we're teaching them new things so that they have a voice, so that they have communications, they have that functional communication, so they can ask for the things they want and turn away the things that they don't. And the more skilled they get with that, the more it's going to get honored by not only you, but by other people. Okay, because if a kid screams in your face and they throw things at you, as an adult, you're going to very much want them to do what you told them to do. Whereas if they're like, hey, I'm just really tired, I've got a headache, I really can I do this tomorrow? You're a lot more likely to be like, you know what? That's reasonable, that's fair. So we want them to have those skills. You think about the kids you work with, can any of them have that sort of a conversation? Almost certainly not. That's why they're here. So we can empower them with that information. So we're giving them those skills so that they have more control over their environment, more access to their reinforcement. And we're teaching consent and withdrawal of consent from day one, right? So prior to teaching them to, ask for a red lollipop, we want to teach them to say no, right? So that they have that skill in their tool belt, because they need to be able to say no. And we need them to know from the very beginning that that is something we value and that we are going to reinforce and we're going to honor. And any time we're teaching something, regardless of trauma informed or whatever, we're always thinking about who those skills benefit, the learner or you, or preferably both, right? Really, we're going, the learner is kind of our priority, but if we can teach them really good skills where they are more cooperative, but also happier, that's a win-win situation. But if we're just teaching them something because it'll make our lives better or easier, then that's kind of not really an ethical way to decide what we're going to work on. So we really want to think about what'll make their lives better. So I added this slide since the previous time. So this is just kind of like a representation of kind of what we're talking about. All right, so here we have this boy, and here we have something highly valuable. In this case, it's Disney World, but, just through your brain, flash all of the valuable things in life, romantic relationship, a well-paying job, trips to your favorite country, money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So I just want you to think of Disney World in this case as highly motivating, reinforcing situations, okay? In the middle of all of these things, this is a briar patch. Genevieve, I'm turning real country, I guess, but there are dangerous, uncomfortable situations that kind of lie between us in any really rewarding kind of situation, right? So all the best things in life, all the really highly reinforcing things in life have kind of some barriers between us and them. So a trauma assumed approach does not say, well, we're never going to go to Disney, right? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say we're just going to get rid of all these. Every time there's thorns, we're just going to get rid of them so the kid can get what they want. Doesn't say that either, right? But it certainly doesn't say that we're just going to push them through, like, just get through it. It's like ripping off a Band-Aid, just run through this uncomfortable situation. We teach them through it. Okay. We lead them through it. We empower them through it. Whatever word you want to pick, really what we're doing is we're not going to help them just completely avoid those things. And we're not just going to skip it. We're going to teach them the skills they need so they can get through that briar patch with as few bleeds as possible. That really helped my brain. I want you to think about Pat Fryman. We talk about him all the time. We're not going to go into the baby in the back seat because if you haven't figured it out yet, watch his amazing TED Talk. But what he recommends is when you come into a situation where someone is angry or irrational, he tells you to take a deep breath, okay, and exhale twice as long as you inhale. So not a box breath, right? I want you to inhale like 8 or 4, and then exhale 8, right? And then do it again, right? So 1 deep breath, longer exhale, do it again, okay? And then after you've gone through that process, then I want you to imagine, okay, turn on your imagination and think, why might they be acting this way? Or in what situation might I act this way? It's the same scenario, but it works differently for different people. Okay, and then once you figured out, like, well, I might do this if my kid were sick. Oh, I might do this if, if I really, if I were in a lot of pain. Oh, I might do that if I were mad about this. So do not proceed until you figured out in what situation might you also do it, and then respond to them with perspective and kindness, right? And once you can flip your brain switch to say like, oh yeah, I might do that too, and recognize that everything is circumstantial, everything is situational. Okay, people are doing things because of their environment. So some barriers to this: some people are going to hate it, some people are going to resist it with huge force. Okay, they're going to say, oh, you're spoiling them, you're babying them, you're setting them up for failure. Okay, but as long as we're doing it in, kind of as we talked about it, not just giving them whatever they want, that's not really the case. But you will have people that fight you tooth and nail about this. Okay, there's not a lot of research on trauma-informed ABA. It's pretty brand spanking new. Okay, a lot of what we're talking about involves private events that we can't measure. Okay, kids feeling safe, kids feeling trust, right? Those are things we can't observe and measure, as well as other things. So that makes it harder. Okay, and the insurance companies aren't really buying into this stuff yet. So there's a lot of gray areas. What about feeding issues? That stuff is not really our realm. Okay, so we shouldn't be making those choices. We're certainly not forcing kids to eat things. Okay, we're just accepting their no. Like if they refuse to eat anything that is nutritious, that's a choice somebody else needs to help us with. Okay, using coercion. Okay, so using reinforcement, right? So that's a gray area. We're not going to stop using it, but we just said that it's coercive. Balancing reinforcement demands, closed economies. So like, oh, you can only have this when I come here. So you're taking away maybe potentially their favorite thing, and they can only have it when you're there. And then we talked about stimming already. So remember to honor their no's, right? Whenever possible, honor the function, right? So why are they doing it? Honor the process. It's not overnight. Okay, we're in it for the long game, and be flexible. Honor that flexibility. Okay, and this does not mean no demands. Then we're not teaching. Okay, there's no value if there's no demands. We're not letting them do whatever they want, because that's not shared governance, right? And we're not going to engage in fierce debates with caregivers like, oh, you're wrong, we need to do it this way, you're ridiculous. Okay, because we need to use this approach towards caregivers too. Okay, so maybe they probably have trauma as well, right? So they feel so strongly about this for a reason. Okay, you guys can look at this. I know we're kind of like running out of time. Oh, we are out of time. Sky, the final code word. Are you still there?
Yes, I am.
It's lizard.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Don't go yet, guys, for anyone who could stay for one more minute. Okay, so the final code word is lizard, which is a weird thing to have on a farm. It's not a farm animal, but it does exist in my house. Okay.
Thank you for clarifying.
So I'm not going to go through all these, but these just kind of give some examples of how you can have a compassionate response. Okay, so when something happens and they're telling you no, okay, you can honor the demand and immediately stop. You could do that. You could keep a portion of the demand on, like you plan to do 10, but you decide to do just one more instead. Or you could prompt them just to say like, hey, can we stop, or touch a brake card or whatever it might be, and then let them be done. But then at the end of all those, you're back to the drawing board. I included a reference on buffers. Okay, this is a tree line buffer. I almost put a picture of just like a wax buffer in there, but that's silly. So it's a new article that I thought was pretty cool, but it goes through some ways that we can teach in an applied behavior analysis manner, the buffers that kind of protect against trauma and re-traumatization. Very similar to protective factors, but they're kind of like honing it down a little bit. Non-negotiables: know how your kids say no, commit to avoiding 100% compliance because it's dangerous, never stop working on manding. If they're in our programs, you must be working on manding. If you can't figure it out, come to one of us. Consider consent and withdrawal consent in all plans and interventions, teaching for it and respecting it. Examining the conditions of your teaching frequently, all the time, constantly, vigilance of that, and providing opt-out treatment situations. So here's the list of references and resources. It's grown quite a bit. You'll see the buffers there at the bottom. You'll see an article on kind extinction, which is kind of in the same kind of thread of things. But yeah, so I can send these out as well. Probably always should. And that's the training. Let me see if I can find my controls so I can stop recording.